She begged Vampire King to pretend she's his wife to escape her stalker. He said, "No pretending." Night had fallen over the kingdom of Nocthur, and the world seemed swallowed by black mist. The moon, a pale ghost, barely lit the jagged peaks and twisted forests that stretched beyond the city walls. The wind whispered secrets through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and fear. Somewhere in the distance an owl cried, a lonely sound that echoed like a warning. Alara ran. Her heart pounded, her skirts tangled around her legs, and each step felt heavier than the last. She dared not look back, yet she could feel it, the presence that had haunted her for days. He had followed her through the crowded streets, through her home, and even through the narrow alleyways of the city. His eyes were always there, burning into her, filled with something she could not name. Fear alone would not have driven her this far. It was desperation, the kind that made a person do impossible things. The road before her led to the northern highlands, a place spoken of in hushed tones by villagers and nobles alike. They said a vampire king ruled there, a being of terrifying beauty and unimaginable power. Some called him cruel, others whispered he had the eyes of someone who had lived for centuries and seen the world bleed. It was said that none dared approach his fortress without reason. Alara's reason was survival. She reached the edge of the forest where the mists were thickest, coiling around her ankles like cold fingers. Her lungs burned, but she pressed on, each step bringing her closer to a fortress that had only existed in legend for her. Kale's castle, carved from black stone, perched atop a jagged cliff. Its towers pierced the night sky like the spires of some dark cathedral. From a distance, it looked as though the night itself had given birth to it. A sudden rustle in the trees made her stumble. Her hands shook as she clutched the small knife she always carried, though she knew it was useless against what followed her. Her pursuer was closer now. She could feel his presence like a shadow clinging to her back, a shadow that would not be shaken. Then, as if the forest itself opened a path, she saw the castle gate rise before her. Its massive doors were etched with symbols she did not recognize, symbols that seemed to shift in the dim light. A sense of awe and terror struck her simultaneously. This was her only hope, yet she was stepping into the unknown, into the domain of a creature whose stories promised danger as much as protection. Alara's legs trembled as she ran the final steps up the winding path to the gates. She banged on the doors with desperate force. "Please," she cried. "I need shelter, please, I beg you." The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. For a moment she feared she had been turned away, left to face her pursuer in the cold night. Then, with a sound like the dragging of iron, the doors slowly opened. A tall figure stood in the shadowed doorway. The moonlight caught his sharp features, pale, flawless, and terrifyingly perfect. His eyes were dark, endless pools that seemed to see through her very soul. Kale, the Vampire King, stood before her, and for a moment Alara felt as though the air itself had thickened around her. "You have come far," he said, his voice smooth, deep, and unyielding. "Why?" Alara swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. I need protection. There's a man following me, he won't stop. I don't know where else to go." Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he studied her as though weighing her courage, her desperation, and her honesty all at once. The air between them was thick, almost alive, charged with tension. Finally, she said, I can't stay hidden forever. I thought maybe if I were your wife, even for a little while, he would leave me alone." The words left her mouth before she could think them through. She had expected him to laugh, to send her away, to refuse her in a way that would leave her shivering in the cold night. Instead, Kale's gaze sharpened and he stepped closer, a shadow among shadows. "No pretending," he said, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of centuries. "I do not take false claims nor false hearts." Alara froze. Her plan had failed before it began. Yet something in his words, something in the way he said them, stirred a strange, unnameable feeling within her. Fear mixed with fascination, and despite the danger, she could not look away. "Then, what am I to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. I cannot go back, please." Kale studied her, his expression unreadable. Then, with emotion both fluid and commanding, he gestured for her to follow him inside. She obeyed, her heart hammering in her chest. Every step into the castle was a step further from safety, yet also a step towards something she could not yet understand. The halls were vast and cold, lined with towering statues of creatures she could not name. Candles burned with a blue flame, casting ghostly shadows that danced across the walls. The air smelled faintly of iron and something sweet, something almost like blood. It made her stomach twist, but also made her pulse race. Kale led her to a chamber high in the tallest tower. The room was large, with tall windows that showed the mountains beyond and a fireplace that was unlit, though embers glimmered faintly at its base. "You will stay here," he said, "safe for now." Alara nodded, barely trusting herself to speak. "Safe for now," she echoed, the words tasting bitter. "But he will not stop. He will not reach you here," Kale replied. "No mortal man walks freely in my lands without invitation." Alara felt a flicker of hope. Yet she also felt the weight of his gaze, the intensity of it, as though he were measuring her very soul. There was power in him, immense and terrifying, but there was also something else, something like loneliness. She dared to take a small step closer. Why do you not send me away?" she asked, her voice soft. Kale's eyes met hers. For the briefest moment he looked almost human, tired, burdened, and perhaps curious. "Because," he said, "you are not afraid enough to run from me, and that makes you interesting." Alara's cheeks burned, but she did not retreat. Something in the way he said that made her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with the strange, frightening thrill of being seen, truly seen, by someone who could undo her life with a single thought. Hours passed, though she had no sense of time. The shadows lengthened, twisted, and seemed to press closer around her. Every sound, the creak of the stone floor, the whisper of wind against the towers, the distant cry of a wolf, made her jump. Yet Kale remained calm, a dark sentinel against the night. Finally, as the first thin light of dawn touched the edges of the mountains, a sudden noise shattered the fragile quiet. A howl, inhuman and chilling, echoed through the castle walls. Alara froze, her blood running cold. Kale's expression darkened instantly, his calm replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. "They are here," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Your pursuer and perhaps others who have followed you." Alara felt terror rise like fire in her chest. She had hoped that the castle, that Kale himself, would be a haven. Now she realized that safety came at a price, one she could not yet see. Kale moved to the window, looking down at the forest below. Shadows shifted, and figures emerged, cloaked in darkness. They moved with unnatural grace, as if the night itself obeyed their command. "You will stay here," he said, turning to her with eyes that seemed to pierce her very heart. "Do not come out, trust me." Alara nodded, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet she stayed. She knew somehow that leaving now would be worse than staying. The night had not yet released its hold on her, and Kale was the only anchor she had. She sank to the floor by the fire, her knees drawn to her chest. The room was silent except for the distant whispers of the wind. Yet even in the silence she could feel it, the gaze of the vampire king, the weight of his presence, the tension that hummed like a living thing in the room. Outside, the shadowy figures crept closer. Inside, Alara waited, trapped between fear and fascination, between life as she had known it, and a world she had never imagined. And somewhere deep within the castle, Kale watched, unblinking, as the night stretched on, and the world beyond his walls threatened to crash into the fragile sanctuary he had offered. The first part of their story had begun, and neither of them knew how far it would go or what darkness lay ahead. The shadows in Kale's castle were longer now, stretching like black rivers across the stone floors. The howl that had echoed through the night faded, but its threat lingered in the cold corners. Alara sat by the small fire, her knees drawn up to her chest, listening to the quiet hum of the castle. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind made her heart jump. Cale stood at the window, a dark silhouette against the pale light of dawn. His gaze was fixed on the northern forest, where the first hints of mist curled among the trees. He did not speak, but Alara could feel the weight of his eyes, unblinking, studying her even as he remained still. Hours passed without a word. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the hum of unspoken questions and dangers that Alara could sense but not name. Finally, she mustered the courage to speak. Who was that?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. The howl, the shadows outside. Cale did not turn immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, and full of authority. "They are not all mortal. Some follow only darkness, some follow men. Your pursuer, he is clever, but he is not the only threat you face. Others are drawn to fear, to weakness, and you have both." Alara shivered. "Weakness? I am not weak. I ran, I fought, I escaped." Cale's gaze shifted to her, piercing yet unreadable. "Running is not weakness, but it is also not safety. You have strength, yes, but it is untested in the true darkness of this world. And that is where I come in." Her stomach tightened. You mean to protect me?" He finally turned, and for a moment the cold edge of his presence seemed almost human. "I protect what is mine," he said, "but do not mistake that for care. My protection has rules, and you will follow them if you wish to survive." Alara nodded, though a small, reluctant spark of trust began to grow. She had nothing left to rely on but him, and something deep inside told her that Cale was no ordinary man. He was danger, yes, but also power. Days passed in a strange rhythm. Cale allowed her to move about the upper towers, but he refused to acknowledge her publicly as anything other than a guest. She ate when she was allowed, walked when permitted, and spent hours watching the changing sky from the tall windows. Each time Cale passed, he spoke little, but his presence was a constant, shadowing her every movement. Alara began to notice small things. The way he tilted his head when he considered her words, the way his hand brushed against the hilt of his sword almost unconsciously, the way his eyes lingered a moment too long when she moved through the halls. Something in him stirred, a trace of curiosity or something more. One evening, as a storm rolled over the northern peaks, she found him in the library. The room was filled with towering shelves of ancient books, their spines cracked and faded. The firelight flickered across his pale face, making his sharp features almost ethereal. "You read too much," he said without looking at her. "You are too mortal to understand half of what you touch." Alara smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but knowledge is my weapon, King Cale. In your world of shadows, I must have something to hold." He finally turned, his dark eyes meeting hers. For the first time, he stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow. "Knowledge is dangerous," he said, "and so are those who seek it. You will need more than books to survive." Alara swallowed. "I will learn anything." Cale's lips twitched, almost a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "Good, then we begin." That night, the first of the shadows returned. Alara heard the faint whisper of movement in the corridors below. She froze, listening. "Do not be afraid," Cale whispered from behind her. He had appeared silently, as if he had always been there. His presence was both terrifying and comforting. "They will not harm you if you stay within my rules." A chill ran through her spine, but she nodded. "I trust you." He studied her, and for a moment the mask of the Vampire King seemed to falter. Then, as quickly as it came, it returned. "Trust is earned," he said. "Do not forget that." The shadows below grew bolder. Shapes moved like smoke, shifting and twisting unnaturally. One figure paused beneath the tower window, and Alara caught a glimpse of a face, pale, twisted, cruel, the very man who had haunted her for days. "Your pursuer," Cale said, his voice a low rumble. "He does not yet understand the forces at work here. That will be his undoing. Alara's chest tightened. What are you going to do? Kale's eyes gleamed with an intensity that made her stomach turn. I will deal with him, he said simply. But you must follow my instructions. You must remain still, silent, invisible to him. One mistake and you may not live to see dawn. The fear in her chest mixed with something else, a strange, almost forbidden thrill. There was no denying the pull she felt toward this dark creature who promised both safety and danger. As the night deepened, Kale led her to a small balcony overlooking the northern forest. The moonlight spilled across the landscape, revealing the twisted trees and jagged rocks. Shadows moved among them like liquid darkness. You see them, Kale said, his voice soft but commanding. They think they can touch you, but they cannot, not while I am here. Alara nodded, gripping the railing. The wind whipped her hair across her face and she shivered, not entirely from cold. I don't understand your power, she admitted. It's frightening. Kale turned, his dark eyes locking with hers. Power is not always visible, he said. Some of it is quiet, hidden. Some of it waits until the moment it is needed most. Hours passed in tense silence. The forest below remained alive with shadows, but Kale's presence was a shield. Alara began to feel a strange sense of safety she had never known before. Yet even as she felt it, a question gnawed at her heart. Why did a creature so dark, so powerful, care for her at all? The answer came in the form of a sudden scream, high, sharp, and full of malice. A shadow broke through the trees and moved swiftly toward the castle. Alara, Kale said, his voice sharp. Inside, now. She obeyed immediately, rushing back into the safety of the tower. Kale followed, moving with the speed and grace of a predator. Within moments, the creature that had pursued her, her stalker, had reached the outer walls. Kale met him there. The wind carried the hiss of confrontation, the sharpness of claws or teeth, the unnatural shimmer of a power neither fully human nor fully beast. Alara could only watch from her tower window as the dark duel unfolded. She saw Kale's eyes flash with fury, a darkness that was more than anger. It was the weight of centuries, the hunger for justice, the force of a being who did not tolerate threats to what he claimed. Shadows bent around him and the wind seemed to carry him forward like a living shadow. The stalker faltered and Alara's breath caught. Kale's power was absolute, terrifying, and yet strangely beautiful. He moved like water and flame combined, precise and inevitable. Within moments, the threat that had haunted her for days was thrown back, fleeing into the night. Alara's hands shook as she stepped back from the window. Kale's gaze found hers across the distance. He did not smile, did not speak. Yet she felt the weight of his presence, heavy and commanding, as if he had claimed some part of her very soul. When he returned to her chamber, silent as the shadows, she finally spoke. You saved me." Kale's eyes softened for the briefest instant, almost imperceptible. "I do not save," he said. "I remove threats. That is not mercy, it is rule." Alara swallowed. "Then why do I feel safe?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then he moved closer and the space between them felt electric, charged with tension that neither could name. "You should not feel anything but caution," he said. "But perhaps that is your mistake." The night stretched on, long and silent, and Alara realized that the castle had become more than a refuge. It was a place where fear and fascination intertwined, where danger and desire met in the shadow of a vampire king. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, she felt it, the invisible bond forming between them, fragile yet unyielding, a chain forged not of iron but of fate, shadows, and a power she could not yet comprehend. The castle of Kale stood silent under the silver light of the moon. But within its walls, tension simmered like a storm ready to break. Alara had grown accustomed to the shadows, to the strange rhythms of life under the vampire king's rule. She moved through the halls with quiet caution, yet she no longer feared them as she once had. The danger outside the walls had been repelled, but another kind of danger, one she could not name, had begun to settle between them. Kale had not spoken of feelings, not once. He had reminded her constantly of the rules. Trust must be earned, attachment was a risk, and pretending meant nothing. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, when the castle was still and the wind whispered through the towers, she felt him watching her, a shadow following every step, unseen yet undeniable. Alara had begun to notice the small things. How his hand lingered near the hilt of his sword when he spoke to her. How his eyes softened just for a moment when she asked questions about the world outside his lands. How he seemed, almost human when he thought no one was looking. She walked into the library one evening, a place where the smell of old parchment and candle wax filled the air. Kale was there, leaning over an ancient manuscript. His eyes were narrowed, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You read too much," he said without looking at her, the corners of his mouth twitching in a way she could not interpret. "You do not yet understand the dangers of knowledge in this world." Alara stepped closer, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "Then teach me," she said softly. "I want to understand, I want to be prepared." He finally looked at her, his dark eyes like pools reflecting the firelight. "Prepared," he repeated, his voice low, smooth, and unreadable. "Some things cannot be prepared for, they must be faced. And some things must be endured." For a moment, silence fell between them. Then he closed the manuscript and turned fully to her. "You are brave, Alara," he said quietly, "more than you realize, but courage alone will not save you in the nights to come." Her heart quickened. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but she sensed the words were forbidden. Instead, she nodded, understanding without understanding. The firelight flickered across his pale skin, casting shadows that danced across the room. Days passed, and the castle became a place of lessons and training. Kale taught her to move quietly through the halls, to sense danger in the smallest of shifts, to notice the subtle signs of magic in the air. She learned quickly, surprising even herself, and with each lesson the bond between them deepened. But danger was never far. One night, as the wind howled and lightning split the sky, a shadow broke through the castle walls. It moved with unnatural speed and grace, and Alara felt a chill run down her spine. Kale appeared beside her without a sound, his presence both terrifying and comforting. "They have returned," he said. "Your pursuer, and he is not alone this time." Alara's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "They bring power you cannot yet understand," Kale replied. "Darkness that bends to their will and a desire to claim what is not theirs. You must trust me completely tonight. One mistake and—" His voice trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken but heavy. The shadows advanced. Alara felt her pulse racing, her heart hammering in her chest. Yet she did not flee. She could feel Kale's power around her, a shield that wrapped her in its strength. They moved through the halls together, silent and precise. Kale's presence was constant, a dark shadow beside her, guiding her, protecting her. She felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The danger was real, but so was the connection she could not deny. In the grand hall, the shadows stopped. Figures cloaked in black emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden. Alara recognized her pursuer among them, but he was changed. His eyes glowed with a strange light, and the air around him shimmered with magic. "You are mine," he hissed, his voice carrying through the hall like a knife, "and she will return with me." Kale stepped forward, his movements fluid and commanding. "No," he said simply, "she is not yours to claim." The two forces met in a clash of light and shadow. Magic and power surged through the hall, making the candles flicker and the walls tremble. Alara watched, her fear rising, but also her admiration for the man who stood between her and death. Kale moved like a shadow and a storm combined, precise and inevitable. The dark forces faltered, unable to match his strength. Yet even as the fight ended, the danger had left its mark. Kale was breathing heavily, his movements slowed, and a faint wound appeared along his arm, dark blood contrasting against his pale skin. Alara rushed to him instinctively, her hands trembling. You are hurt," she whispered, fear breaking through her composure. Kale looked at her, his dark eyes softening for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "It is nothing," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I will heal. You should not fear." But Alara did fear. Fear and something more, a longing she did not yet understand, a pull toward this powerful, dangerous being who had saved her life more than once. She pressed a hand to his arm, feeling the warmth beneath his cold skin. I cannot just stand by," she said. I want to help." Kale's gaze held hers, intense and unyielding. "You must be careful," he said. "To care too much is to weaken yourself." And yet, his voice trailed, and for a moment he seemed uncertain, almost human. "And yet, you are different. You do not fear me as others do." Alara's heart pounded. She did not understand the effect she had on him, and she did not dare ask. But she knew that something had shifted. The walls between them, always present, were beginning to crumble, imperceptibly but undeniably. In the days that followed, the castle returned to a tense calm. The shadows outside retreated, but their presence lingered like a threat in the wind. Kale resumed his lessons with Alara, teaching her not only to defend herself, but to sense the currents of magic that flowed unseen. One evening, as they walked through the gardens, the sky painted with the pale colors of twilight, Kale spoke. "You must understand something," he said quietly. "The world beyond these walls is dangerous. It tests the heart, the mind, and sometimes the soul. You will not survive it alone." Alara met his gaze. "I do not wish to be alone," she admitted, her voice soft. "Not with you, not anymore." Kale's eyes darkened, a storm behind the calm. He said nothing, but the moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken truths. She felt the pull of his presence, the magnetic force that had always surrounded him, stronger now, almost irresistible. That night, a whisper of movement stirred her from sleep. Outside her window, a shadow glided across the castle walls, fast and silent. The stalker had returned, braver, more dangerous. He carried with him a dark artifact, pulsing with a strange energy that seemed to drink the light from the air. Alara felt her pulse race. She could not face this alone. She ran through the hallways to Kale's chambers, breathless. "He's back," she said. He has some kind of magic." Kale appeared beside her immediately, silent as the shadows. "I know," he said, "and this time it will not be simple." Together they moved toward the main hall. The air was thick with tension, charged with the pulse of magic and the promise of confrontation. The artifact glowed in the darkness, illuminating the stalker's pale face and cruel smile. Kale stepped forward, his presence filling the hall like a storm. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice echoing. "Step closer and you will regret it." The stalker sneered, raising the artifact. Shadows surged around him, twisting into forms that seemed alive. Alara felt a wave of fear, but she stood her ground, sensing Kale's strength at her side. In a sudden rush, Kale moved, faster than her eyes could follow. He struck with precision, shattering the artifact with a force that sent sparks of energy scattering. The stalker stumbled, surprised, and fled into the night, leaving only echoes of his malice behind. Alara sank to the floor, her hands trembling. He's gone," she whispered. Kale knelt beside her, his dark eyes searching hers. "For now," he said, "but he will return. And next time, he may bring more than shadows." Alara felt the weight of his words and something else, a deep, unspoken bond that had grown stronger in the fires of danger. She looked at him, and in that moment the fear that had defined her life seemed to melt away, replaced by something she could not yet name but felt with every heartbeat. Kale reached out, his hand hovering near hers. She did not flinch. Instead, she let him take it. The touch was brief, but it sent a shiver down her spine, binding them together in a connection neither fully understood. And as they stood there, the castle silent around them, they both knew the truth. The nights ahead would test them, challenge them, and perhaps break them. Yet neither could deny the bond that had begun to form, a bond of trust, of power, of something far deeper than either had expected. The storm outside had passed, but within the castle, a new storm had begun. One of hearts, shadows, and desires that neither could resist. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the walls, the stalker waited, biding his time, while Kale and Alara prepared for the night to come. A night that would demand courage, cunning, and a bond forged in the fires of danger and longing. The castle of Kale stood quiet under moonless sky, the high walls casting long black shadows over the courtyard. Inside, a tense stillness hung in the air, as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. Alara moved through the corridors, her heart pounding. She had learned to trust her instincts, to feel the currents of magic that shifted invisibly around the castle. But tonight, those currents felt stronger, darker, and more urgent than ever. Kale stood at the top of the grand staircase, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the walls. His expression was unreadable as always, but Alara sensed the weight he carried. He had grown more silent in recent days, more controlled, and yet she could feel the storm brewing inside him. "They are coming," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of certainty. "Your pursuer and the darkness he commands. This night will not be simple." Alara nodded. "I understand," she said, "but I will not hide, not anymore. I will stand with you." Kale's eyes met hers, dark and piercing. For a moment the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words. "You are brave," he said softly, "and foolish, but that may save you." Together, they descended into the courtyard. The moonless night made the shadows deeper, twisting like living things around the stone walls. The wind carried whispers, faint and eerie, and Alara could feel the pull of dark magic before she even saw its source. Figures emerged from the mist beyond the walls. The stalker was among them, his face pale and twisted with malice, and at his side, strange forms flickered and shifted, shadows that moved like they were alive. The artifact he had carried before glowed faintly, pulsing with a dark light that seemed to drink the air itself. Alara felt a shiver run down her spine. We cannot fight them alone," she said, turning to Kale. He stepped forward, his presence filling the courtyard like a storm. "We do not fight alone," he said. "We fight together, you and I as one." The words sent a thrill through her. Together. For the first time she felt the bond between them, strong and unbroken, something more than fear or respect. It was trust, it was connection, it was something she could not yet name but knew she would never forget. The stalker raised his hand and the artifact pulsed brighter. Shadows surged forward, twisting and writhing toward them. Kale moved like a shadow himself, his movements precise, his speed impossible to follow. Alara ran beside him, guided by his hand when needed and protected by his presence. "Focus," Kale said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Feel the currents of magic, sense their weakness." Alara closed her eyes for a moment and reached deep inside herself. She had learned much under Kale's guidance, to sense the flow of power, to anticipate movements, to trust her instincts. She felt the shadows, rhythm, the pulses of energy, and she pointed toward their center. Kale's eyes followed hers, and without a word he struck. His power surged outward like a black wave, striking the shadows and dispersing them in bursts of light and energy. The stalker faltered, anger and fear crossing his face for the first time. "You cannot win," Kale said, his voice low and commanding. "This ends tonight." The stalker's magic flared again, but Kale was faster. He moved like a living shadow, precise, unstoppable. Alara followed his movements, her fear now tempered with courage. She felt the bond between them strengthen with every strike, every step, every heartbeat. Finally, Kale reached the stalker. The two faced each other, power against power, shadow against shadow. The courtyard trembled with the force of their presence. Alara stepped forward, placing a hand on Kale's arm. "You are not alone," she whispered. "I am here." For the first time, Kale's eyes softened completely. He glanced at her, and in that moment something shifted. His power surged, not just with force, but with intention, with protection, with love, with the bond they had forged through danger and trust. With a final, decisive motion, Kale struck the stalker's artifact. It shattered, releasing a burst of dark energy that rolled across the courtyard and dissipated into the night. The stalker screamed, his power broken, and vanished into the shadows, leaving only silence in his wake. Alara sank to her knees, her hands trembling. It's over," she whispered. Kale knelt beside her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "For now," he said. "But the night is long and darkness never truly dies." She looked at him, her heart full. "I do not care," she said softly. "I only care for you." Kale's gaze held hers, intense and unwavering. For a moment the centuries of his life, the weight of his power, the loneliness of immortality all seemed to fade. "And I care for you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words sent a shiver through her. The Vampire King, who had seemed untouchable, distant, and terrifying, had revealed a part of himself, a part she could see, could feel, could trust. Days passed, and the castle settled into a fragile peace. The shadows outside had receded, the threat of the stalker gone, at least for now. Alara and Kale moved through the castle together, their bond growing stronger, unspoken but undeniable. They spent time in the gardens under the pale sunlight that rarely touched the northern highlands. Kale taught her to sense the world in ways beyond sight, the whispers of the wind, the currents of magic, the rhythm of life and death. She learned quickly, not just from lessons but from observation, and from the moments she spent near him, feeling the pulse of his presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kale led her to the highest tower. The wind tugged at her hair, the vastness of the world spread before them, and she felt a sense of freedom she had never known. "You have changed," Kale said quietly. "Since the night you came here, you have grown stronger, braver, wiser." Alara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "I have not changed alone," she said softly. "You taught me, guided me. You were always there." Kale's gaze softened. "And I will always be, but strength alone is not enough. To survive, to live, you must also trust and love and endure." She reached for his hand, feeling the warmth beneath his cold skin. "I do," she said. "I trust you, and I love you." For a long moment, Kale said nothing. Then he drew her close, the shadows of the castle stretching around them like a protective cloak. "And I love you," he whispered, the words carrying centuries of longing and restraint. "You are my heart in the night, Alara, my anchor, my companion, my life." The first light of dawn touched the mountains, casting a soft glow across the courtyard. Together they stood in silence, the world stretching out before them, vast and endless. The darkness had been defeated, at least for now, but the bond between them had been forged in fire and shadows, danger and trust. Alara felt a warmth in her chest she had never known. The fear, the desperation, the uncertainty, all had led her here to this moment, to him. Kale, the Vampire King, was no longer just a protector or a ruler. He was her companion, her equal, her heart entwined with hers. The castle was still, the night receding into memory, but the bond between them was unbroken, eternal like the mountains themselves. And even as peace settled over the fortress, Kale whispered, his voice low and full of shadows and promise, "The night is long, and so are we, but some shadows never die. And we will face them together." Alara smiled, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers. "Together," she repeated. For the first time she felt truly safe, truly alive, and truly loved. The darkness of the world could not touch them, not now, not ever. They had faced it, conquered it, and in doing so had found each other. The dawn rose over the northern highlands, spilling golden light over the black towers of the castle, and Alara knew, deep in her heart, that this was only the beginning. The night had tested them, shaped them, and revealed the depth of their bond. Whatever the shadows that remained, whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. And in the quiet of the first morning light, the Vampire King and the woman he had claimed, not by pretense, not by fear, but by choice, stood side by side, ready to embrace whatever the world would bring.